Well, hello everybody. I'm Richard Thomas. I'm chair of the Guernsey Data Protection Authority, and I'm delighted for today's conversation, 28th of April, to be talking to Ellis Parry, who's the ethics advisor at the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK. Ellis, welcome. Could you please introduce yourself and say a few words about your role as ethics advisor?
Oh, yeah, thank you for having me, Richard. So I'm Ellis Parry, and I'm at the Information Commissioner's Office as the Data Ethics Advisor. So my role is really to articulate the Information Commissioner's position on how data ethical considerations can help get the GDPR right. What is the interplay between data ethics and the GDPR principles?
And so you've been doing that for a while, and I'm sure you've made a big contribution
Yes.
to the success of the ISO. And you've been around data protection for quite a few years now. You've shared a little bit of detail about our project Bijou, which is a social initiative looking to shift culture, change behavior, and reduce harm when it comes to handling personal data. Much of the project is human-based, telling stories. And I wonder, could I invite you to sort of tell a story from anywhere in your data protection experience, which really emphasizes the importance of data protection?
And I think, like so much, mine is going to be very relevant and very recent. While at the Information Commissioner's Office, I was sent on a secondment to the information governance team at NHSX as the government was thinking about its first iteration of the contact and trace app for COVID-19. And that was a very, very interesting experience. And they took the decision to pursue a centralized model of data processing rather than a decentralized model. So under principles of privacy by design and by default, I think a decentralized model was preferred, and the Information Commissioner did indeed issue some guidance indicating her belief that a decentralized model was preferential, although not ruling out a centralized model. So they went along with the centralized model in the face of some resistance, including Google and Apple saying that their operating systems would not cooperate with such a centralized model. So several weeks, if not months, were spent on that. And in the end, that first app did indeed fail. And they then pivoted to the decentralized approach. So on-device processing, much more privacy-friendly, privacy by design and default being catered for. That app was subsequently rolled out. So it's a real example of, if you think about the things at the beginning, if you think about first principles as you take your first steps, as you go further down the journey, it will help you get data protection right and avoid costly delays and indeed wasted money in that example.
Well, that's a fascinating story, Ellis. We're right at the coalface there, an example of the importance of getting it right time and thinking through the implications. So fascinating story. You may notice that our project Bijou has one of its objectives to improve ethical decision making. Can you give an example of the adoption of an ethical approach inside an organization which has really brought tangible benefits?
Yes, so I think, again, during the pandemic, I was consulted by one of the very large telecoms companies here in the UK, and they were concerned. They wanted to help the government understand community transmission of COVID-19 by looking at the positioning, the geolocation of people's mobile phones potentially, but understood that that had legal implications, including, of course, the GDPR. So they undertook, and it was the first time I'd ever heard this phrase, and I really liked it because I think it showed a real hallmark of good quality thinking and planning. They undertake something called a human impact assessment, not a privacy impact assessment, not a data protection impact assessment, not a kind of equalities impact assessment or a human rights impact assessment. They undertake a human impact assessment. Now that has all of those elements in it. So it really was a kind of one-stop shop way of considering all the legal obligations. And they reached a conclusion whereby they felt they could sufficiently anonymize and aggregate the data, but still have valuable information that could help with government response planning to COVID-19 and community transmission issues.
That's very, very interesting. I mean, certainly reinforces my belief that, you know, it's data protection ultimately is about people protecting people. It's not data protection,
Yeah.
it's people protection. That's a very interesting example of that. Going a bit wider than the Bijou project, you may have seen that our sort of strapline at the Guernsey Data Protection Authority is excellence through ethics. And I just wonder, could you sort of give your view as to what we actually mean by data ethics?
Yes, so I mean, that's part of the work that I've been undertaking at the ICO and as part of the public consultation which we undertook. And at its very heart, I see it as a holistic way to discharging all the legal obligations that you may be subject to, particularly in the public sector, where those legal obligations are come in the form of things like the Equalities Act and the Human Rights Act. Many large corporates also have an eye to those issues because they are indeed indirectly impacted by them. And it helps organizations answer the question rather than could we do this? Can we do this? Technology does allow lots of novel processing operations now. It allows you to think about whether you should do it. So it helps you with the could versus the should, which over time, I think, as an organization, if you prove you're trustworthy with data, will help maintain public trust and their confidence in you as a data controller in this regard, and therefore continue their relationship and hopefully grow their relationship in the digital economy to the benefit of everybody, but while being sufficiently protected and having the confidence that their fundamental rights are being sufficiently protected.
Okay, so it's really going, I mean, sometimes, you get a sort of message, the techies say we can do this, the lawyers saying we can do this, but then the ethical approach is actually, should we do it? Is that really summing up what you're trying to say?
Yes, and then once you've decided if it's something you should do, I think it will then inform how, relying probably more then back to the core data protection principles, which is where that relationship between the two, I think, really comes to the fore to the benefit of both disciplines. Yeah.
Well, you can certainly sometimes sort of lose, this focus on the almost the morality of what you're doing by getting too tied up with sort of the minutiae of the legal requirements. I mean, those fundamental data protection principles are actually quite easy, but they are so fundamental. And
and I think so. Just really quickly, because we were talking earlier about Jonathan Bamford when he gave his leaving speech when he left the ICO last year, he held up the very first 1984 Act, which I think was possibly 34 pages long. And he said, and it's really interesting, the volume of black and white letter law that we have now, when we started with 34 pages, and actually, but the principles haven't changed that much. So although data protection law looks like it's getting more and more complicated, its very heart has actually been really quite cohesive and consistent throughout this journey.
Yeah. Well, and I'm delighted. As you know, I've got a vested interest in what the ICO does, having been there for my 7 years. But I'm so proud of what I see, and taking this sort of wider ethical approach is so important. Just a final question to wrap up, Ellis, which I think perhaps goes a little wider still, which is, we want people in Project Bijou to sort of use the human side to tell the stories, to spread the stories, to spread the word. What's your experience as to how people can best really engage and spread the word? What sort of advice would you be giving?
Yeah, you're right. I think you can now employ, there is almost an industry around data protection advice of some very, I'm sure, talented and high-priced lawyers that produce very lengthy opinions on the kind of, could you do this, can you do this, rather than the should. So I think people need to be asking questions. I think the core data protection principles around fairness definitely have a role to play in terms of ethically people thinking about what is and what is not fair. How you articulate fairness can definitely have an ethical component. As part of our public consultation, a very high percentage of people, in the 80% of the people who responded, felt that when undertaking a legitimate interest balancing test under Article 6, they felt that ethical considerations could help you strike the right balance there if you were relying on that particular processing ground. So ask questions about fairness, examine fairness, accountability, and at the very heart of this, again, is transparency. Are people sufficiently well informed about what is happening to their information and the safeguards which are in place, not only under the legislation, which are necessary, but also then potentially more broadly, are you putting safeguards in place which satisfy people and maintain their trust and confidence in what you're doing with their personal data?
Well, that's very, very interesting and very helpful, Ellis. I think what you're saying really about the importance of awareness, the importance of asking questions, that applies both to people inside organizations, but also just to the general public. We're talking about, men, women, children, consumers, employees. It's not just data subjects, it's actually people seeking to benefit, and they can ask the question too sometimes.
Well, yes, I think I saw a 12-year-old is suing TikTok. And I think if a 12-year-old understands their GDPR rights sufficiently to launch an action, then hopefully the commissioners are doing something right in educating the public about their rights.
Ellis, I'm afraid time is running out, but you've been really helpful in sort of bringing our project to life. You put emphasis on the role of ethics. And I think one phrase that will really come out of this conversation is it's not just can we do something, it's pausing, should we do something? And that applies to particularly public and private organizations, because data protection regulates government as well as private commercial organizations. And should we do it is a hugely important question. Well, thank you very much indeed, Ellis. And I'll be sharing more news with you as to Bijou unfolding over the weeks and months ahead. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much.